Electric Cafe.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Electric Cafe. Today is day number 27 in my month-long focus on subgenres of rock and electronic music that fuse both, like shoegaze and new wave and stuff like that. And I'm a few days behind. Today's actually the 1st of June, but I'm a few days behind. I got 5 more videos to do to wrap up the focus month. Today's on Black Marble's A Different Arrangement, which came out in 2012. Me and Black Marble have a long history. Back in 2012, 2000, yeah, I think that was 2012 or 2011. I first heard them on Pandora, and I was really blown away because I heard a couple songs, and I still have a sealed copy from 2012, which it's funny because I bought it at Amoeba Records in California when I was probably on vacation in 2000, somewhere around 2010 or 2012 or some, or 2012 or 2014. And because I think I went there out those 2 years, 2010 too, but this came out in 2012. For a while there, I was going to California like every year to go on vacation, where I'm from. And it's funny, you can see in the corner here an Amoeba with the price tag of $14.98 for an album. Shows you how much prices have gone up, but which is understandable. But this is an LP for $14.98. Um, but for a sealed copy of this now is probably over $100 for this now. But I haven't kept it sealed for that reason. I just, sometimes I really like albums and I buy them on CD and vinyl. Also, that year they came out with the single, which has Pretender on it, really good track, and also Balancing. And if you go on YouTube and check out Black Marble, Pretender, or Balancing, and you'll check out an old video of Black Marble with the two original band members in it. They're playing like in a dark room, and they played both tracks together, and that was really important. That video, and then also buying their album, and Black Marble became one of my favorite bands through this album, and then through their second album. Their third and their fourth album, I'll review those in the future too. But to be honest with you, I probably heard the third album maybe 5 times, and I heard the fourth album maybe twice. It kind of lost a little bit of the steam of the first two albums. This one is very raw. Second album is a little bit more polished, but I think I really, really enjoy the first two albums. I think they're fantastic. And so if you haven't heard this album and you like bands like New Order and yeah, I mean, really, it's kind of like a Coldwave and a sort of synth wave, but there's a little bit of like, I don't know. You'll hear from the bass lines and stuff like that. It's a very New Order, but it almost has like a surf rock feel to me, like a Darkwave surf rock, because the bass lines and stuff. It's really interesting. But just a fantastic album, and we'll come back and I'll give you my review on each track and each album. But let's check out the album if you haven't heard it. I'll play the whole album because it's not very long. I think it's like 37 and a half minutes. So play the album and you'll see my score on each track above, and then I'll give you my overall thoughts when I come back. But yeah, let's check out a Black Marble, A Different Arrangement. a chance to check out each track on a different arrangement by Black Marble, which came out in 2012. As you can see from my scores on each track, just a really consistent album, really excellent album. It's just it's in some respects it's near perfect in a way. I can't give it a perfect score, of course. There's always opportunities, I think, and it's always hard to give such a new album such a high score as well. It usually I feel like you have to, even if it's a decade in, I feel like you still need to give an album more room to grow and sort itself out to be considered a classic. But in many respects, this is a classic of Coldwave and a classic of the resurgence in 80s sounds in Coldwave. Just the mix of Darkwave and post punk on here into like this kind of Coldwave sound is just amazing. This album was just so much, in my opinion, was so much more ahead of the curve. And what really sets this album apart for me is, there's some other bands that I like that are sort of into this sound, and I like one or two songs, or maybe even three or four. But this album is so consistent, and it has such a great balance of the slower songs and the more upbeat songs, and the driving songs, and then the more atmospheric songs. It just has everything for any kind of fan of synth pop and new wave and dark wave. It just has everything in it. The raw production, I love the vocal effects. It's a great balance of upbeat and then low key. A great balance of darker and still a euphoric sound in there. It's almost like I've seen Black Marble twice in concert. I think it was like 2017 and maybe like 2019, and it's just like a euphoric, upbeat kind of jam. Like some of their tracks and their bass lines, and just like a different arrangement. The track, for example, just really kind of invigorates you and really like makes you feel alive. It's just such a they can do such a great job, especially. I don't know the evolution of the band. I do have the second, third, and their fourth album, and from my understanding, I think the first two albums were done with the lead singer and then the other gentleman, and then I think they changed to a second guy. They changed out the second guy in the third and fourth album, and I don't know if that made is the reason for the difference or just the evolution or but just this album is so raw, and then their second album is really well done and really polished, and I probably even like that in a different way, maybe equally or even more. Like there's some songs on that album, on the second album, that I think are even better than this, than songs on here, but this one is probably the more complete album, especially if you like more of the raw sound. But I do really like the second album. But on the third and the fourth, I gotta give them some more listens still, but they just didn't grab me very much like the first two albums did. And so it's kind of disappointing. So I'm not sure if that's because of the second member, although I know the first member is the singer. He probably writes all the music. He's probably the main person in the band. And I'll be honest, I had a kind of an argument with the lead singer online one time about him selling his records online. And I got a chance to meet him. I even took a picture with him and got a chance to talk with him outside of the concert for like 20, 30 minutes with my friends. And he seemed like a really cool guy. I mean, he's from New York, LA. So, my parents are from New York. I'm from LA. So, we seem like we have this sort of same dispositions. And he seemed like a cool guy, although he seemed kind of a little bit standoffish, maybe. But maybe it's just because I was such a fan of his music at first, and then sort of the second time I saw him, he seemed a little bit more relaxed. But maybe I was just too much. But I just really I still have an integrity about me when it comes to like selling any music. And when I saw that he was selling reissues of his records for 60, $70, I kind of was like, dude, why don't you just sell more copies of your record than sell them for so more people can get them than sell them for 60, $70 a copy. I just can't imagine like a small band selling their own music for 3 times what it's worth because other people are selling your first editions for more expensive. Just kind of like irked me, and he called me a clown and stuff like that. But I don't think he knew I was the same person. But it is what it is. But I had a disagreement. But that doesn't take away from how I feel about his music. I still really like his first 2 albums, especially, and they're all time classics for me in some ways. When I think of this genre and I think of the resurgence in this style of music through the 2010s, especially for the last like 15 years. So, it doesn't take away from my opinion on how that interaction went. It was just a disagreement, anyways, about selling your records. I just don't feel like you should sell your own records for what sharks are selling their records for. Your first editions when you're selling a reissue. I just didn't think that was uh, good integrity. To do to your fans too. Just sell your record for more expensive than what's reasonable, just because you think it asked for that. I think that's kind of weak. Anyways, back to the record. It's just like I love the bass line on here. Obviously, it's a very Joy Division New Order bass line, but it has like this kind of like surf rock feel to it that's really interesting. Like in Pretender, for example. There's even some good electronic sounds in here, like on Limitation, and also the keyboard in Pretender. The atmosphere in the tracks Last and Unreleased, really nice. It's just like a Coldwave brilliance. And it's also dancey too. Like there's definitely 4 or 5 tracks on here that you can get up and dance to. And they work great on dance floor. Nice, short and concise 3-minute tracks. Really kind of get out. It's just like such a perfect album in so many ways. Um, the sound and the balance of the styles, the catchiness while still being edgy, like in Safe Minds, the track number 10. And it's just really true to the sound of the original kind of Coldwave, and really kind of setting the tone and setting the example of what a a cold wave sort of vintage sounding album can sound like. And to think that there's only 2 members in the band that are creating this sound, I mean, it's you get more from two members of the band with some good studio techniques and good sound manipulating and processing more than an entire band. It seems like. I mean, it's just powerful music, And then there's times where there's some beautiful songs, like A Great Design is my favorite song on the album, and that's not even their sort of sound. It's more of their low key sound. And then it goes right into my second favorite track, A Different Arrangement, which is more upbeat. For my third favorite song, it could be any number of one. I also rated 3 tracks 8 stars. So, I mean, you have 5 tracks over 8 stars, and then the other 6 over 7. Just a consistent album, and it's almost like perfecting the sound, perfecting the style this album does. Just for the consistency and all the 11 tracks being over a 7 each. In some ways it's perfect. I also gave it an extra 5 points on the total album to take it from a 78, or four extra points, excuse me, taking it from a 78 average all the way up to an 82. I do feel like this is a classic of the genre, classic of the new style of making vintage cold wave and dark wave sounds and post punk. Just a fantastic album, and it's hard not to say this is a classic especially from those who know this album. Just a really excellent album, and really set the precedence for what you can do with the sound, in my opinion. Just a really excellent album. And will it ever grow into the low 90s and be an all-time classic? I don't know. That'll take years. That'll take a couple decades to fully understand and sort of you know take the last 20 years of the cold wave revival, post-punk revival in this last decade and a half, and sort of encapsulate it and review it and see how this album fits into the best of the best, and see if it can kind of get into that range. From what the album is, I don't think it can be an all-time classic because of the style. It doesn't necessarily, um, if somebody was into like pop music, or had no idea about cold wave or dark wave, and I gave them the album, would they really like it? I don't know. I don't know if it can be like that kind of crossover classic of an all-time classic, regardless of genre. and it's not trying to be. It's a classic of what it is, right? It's a classic, in my opinion, already a future classic of the style of genre it's aiming at, and successfully does. Just an excellent album. 82 out of 100. You know, definitely a new classic, and for me to give an album, you know, that's non-electronic based, this is like non-techno, non-ambient, non, you know, house, you know, not that side of the music that I sometimes review, but of the more rock based albums, for me to give it an 80 in an album that's less than 15 years old is really saying something, and you'll probably see that in my reviews. This is the highest rated album in my focus month this month. The only album I believe that made it into the 80s, right? Oh no, Twin Tribes Shadows also made it in the 80s, and that was actually a similar. That's also a Darkwave album, but not post punk. But yeah, those two albums. When I think of some of the best of Darkwave and Cold and sort of the post punk, Twin Tribes and Black Marble are probably two of the best. You know that I can think of. Two great examples of bands that are really capturing the old sound, and taking it to another level, and then also having the tracks and the vocals and the lyrics and everything sort of meet that, and then it also have a trajectory of it sinking in and being more catchy and being more listenable and being like a go-to album. Like, you know, there's so many times where somebody's like, "Hey, can you recommend me a Darkwave album or something like Cold or new Coldwave album? What's a good revival album of that style of, like, you know, Joy Division?" Black Marble is the album that I always go to. It's always one I've gone to for the last 13 years since I've had the album. Just a fantastic CD, fantastic album. Get a copy if you get a chance. You won't be disappointed. Of course, I mean, if you already heard the album which I just played, you're probably already looking for a copy. If you know, if you like the sound, then I'm sure you're already looking for a copy because it's a great album. But I appreciate your time, and thanks for your support as always. 82 out of 100 for Black Marble, a different arrangement.
Electric Cafe.